I've got a horrible feeling that this is something that's supposed to go in the opposite direction. Do you find your opinions are getting stronger or weaker as you get older? Do you? I mean, they get stronger, right? Do you become more entrenched, more set in your ways? How strong were your opinions about the Second Gulf War, when George W. Bush sought to essentially finish what his father had started in the Middle East and sort of wreak vengeance as well, arguably, for the September the 11th atrocity, and decided that toppling Saddam Hussein, who had nothing really to do with the September the 11th atrocity, would be a good way of setting the record straight, or a good way of rebalancing the world. I bet you had quite a strong opinion about it. If you're well, depending on your age, of course, it's perfectly possible that you weren't born. But if you were conscious and of an age to take an interest in the news, and if you are, I suppose, the sort of person who enjoys listening to a radio station like LBC, then you probably had quite a strong opinion about it. It was very much the bread and butter of current affairs debates. Can I make a small confession to you? I, at the time, was doing my first ever job in the arena of public opining. It was the first time I'd ever really been paid to talk on air about my opinions. And I'm very grateful for one thing, well, two things. One, the opportunity to move into this ludicrous apology for a living. But the other was that the world of viral clips and internet ubiquity did not exist when I started cutting my teeth on a television program, actually, not a radio program, because the way that the program was set up meant that every morning you had to have a pro and an anti, whatever the subject. There was the same three of us on the panel every day. And there was a host, Matthew Wright, now, of course, of this parish. And myself and a journalist called Kate Silverton would have to argue with each other. We were never allowed to agree. The nature of the programme was such that one of us had to be pro and one of us had to be anti. And that meant, inevitably, that you often or sometimes had to argue the position that you didn't hold, because otherwise the whole premise of the programme wouldn't have worked. And we certainly didn't encourage telling the audience that one of us was arguing a position that we didn't really hold. Because I'm a bit of an idiot, hopefully a bit less of an idiot today than I was then, I rather relished the opportunity to argue the opposite of what I believed, because it was a bit like, I don't know, it was a bit like being a Harlem Globetrotter. It wasn't normal basketball, but it was an opportunity to show off a skill set that I was unjustifiably proud of. So I would often find myself on television, on Channel 5, 20-odd years ago, arguing very persuasively and very passionately something that I didn't actually believe in. I want you to know something, and this will sound a little bit silly, but I'm deadly serious. I've never done that here. I would never do that here. A, I don't have to. I'm not complaining. It was what I signed up for when I took that job. And B, I wouldn't want you to think that I would ever indulge in those sort of tactics today. But I did it quite a lot. And it means I sometimes can't remember. Because you can argue yourself into a position as well. It's very much sixth form debating society. But the really good debaters are the ones who can win debates when they're arguing something they don't even agree with themselves. And it means that you almost argue yourself into a position. It was such a long time ago that I can remember arguing on the television that the United Kingdom, and more obviously the United States of America, had a moral obligation, a sort of international duty to topple Saddam Hussein. And I can also remember going on the march against the war in Glasgow. And I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit that I can't completely remember where my authentic or my sincere self lay. Because you argue something so often that you almost end up believing it yourself. But I think I was very 52-48, an infernal ratio, before we even knew it was the infernal ratio. And I wobbled a bit. But the argument that I always sat with, the argument that I think nudged me into the 52 rather than the 48, was that if you have 10 hideous despots lined up against the wall and you've only got one bullet, you have to shoot one of them. I apologise for the slightly sort of brutal nature of that analogy, but it's figurative, obviously, except in Saddam Hussein's case, of course, it's literal as well. But that was what I thought was the zinger, what I thought was the argument. That's why I began by asking whether you think your opinions have got stronger. Is if I said weaker, It's funny, right? So if your opinions got weaker, if I said more considered, have your opinions become more nuanced, more thoughtful, more complex as you've got older? That doesn't sound the same as saying, have they become weaker? Have your opinions got stronger? Or have they become more authentic and valid? Because, you know, the idea of picking a side or going all footballification or binary on complicated issues, particularly of geopolitics, is a little bit absurd, right? A little bit absurd. But I can't remember. And I remember that little bit of argument that I thought was pretty unassailable. And I don't think that now. And part of the reason I don't think that now is as I sort of glance at my screens in the studio this morning and see that the United States is contemplating military intervention in Iran, where the regime is objectively hideous, just as Saddam Hussein's regime was objectively hideous, or the Taliban's regime in Afghanistan was objectively hideous. Libya, perhaps. Well, definitely objectively hideous. But what have all those countries got in common, apart from Western intervention? Yeah, exactly. So the lessons of history are pretty stark, aren't they? But confine it even perhaps to American-led intervention. Confine it still further, focus further on American-led intervention in the Middle East. It rarely ends well, does it? It rarely ends well. And that's why today I have a question for you, an obvious question, a question that you have almost certainly already established, but it is, I mean, on a complicated level, it is what should the West do? And then obviously on a simpler level, it is should, and how relevant is the identity of the United States president? You have an administration that shoots innocent civilians in the street and lies about it. And that's important, you know. Obviously, the numbers in Iran dwarf the numbers in Minneapolis, but the principle is the same. Peaceful protesters being murdered for dissent. Not even for dissent, really, just because the security services in America, it's ICE. In Iran, it's the secret police, the religious police. They are out of control. They are a law unto themselves. They act with complete impunity. And I imagine the Ayatollahs would queue up to lie about what the religious police in Iran have done in exactly the same way that Donald Trump and his closest cronies have queued up to lie about what happened to Renee Nicole Good on the streets of Minneapolis. Even as we can see with our own eyes and ears that they are lying, still they lie. Still they lie. And that's important. Not because the two events are exactly the same by any stretch of the imagination, but because it would be an American-led intervention. I mean, it can't really come from anywhere else. Technically, I suppose China or Russia could get involved. Russia is pretty overstretched in Ukraine, and China, I doubt, is particularly interested at this point. But they're sympathetic to the current regime, so they wouldn't want to get involved in overthrowing it. So it would be an American-led intervention. And America is led by Donald Trump, a man whose flirtations with fascism edge ever closer to complete consummation. And we would be, I imagine, trailing along behind. Or was it poodle? Was Tony Blair called a poodle? George W. Bush's poodle, if I remembered that correctly? It is a question about domestic political decisions, as in what should Keir Starmer do, what should the UK do. But it's actually a question about the world, isn't it? It's a question about whether or not you think the West should do anything in Iran. I apologise for this, and this is why I slightly worry. It's all right for you if your opinions are getting more thoughtful and more nuanced as you get older, but it's not exactly ideal traditionally for a radio phone-in host. I blame therapy. But I don't know now. I suspect that the arguments I used about invading Iraq no longer persuade even me. No matter how hideous the regime may be, the West exercising its might and muscle to change regime never I can't think of an example when it's worked really well. Perhaps that could be one way for you to get into this conversation. But it rarely works. So sure, and Syria would be the example of non-intervention and, you know, imperfect though the current regime in Syria is, it is at least a consequence of Syrian action as opposed to external promotion. And you've got a former ISIS fighter now in charge in Syria. And Syria arguably fulfilled all the criteria that people opposed to the Second Gulf War didn't feel that the Second Gulf War fulfilled. There's a stronger case for intervention in Syria than there was for intervention in Iraq, objectively speaking. And yet we did the one with the lower justification and didn't do the one with the greater. But I don't know enough to say that Syria is in slightly better shape than Middle Eastern countries where America has led intervention. I don't know enough to say that. But I think it is. I suspect it is. And it certainly feels different to have a leader who has risen organically through the ranks as opposed to one who has been essentially imposed externally. So if you have Iranian heritage, and a lot of people in London do, I know quite a few, of course. We were treated to insights from Shaparat Khorsandi or Omid Jalili when the last rebellions on the street looked as if they may come to fruition. But I just want to know whether or... Because you remember that many Venezuelan people, particularly expats, it's hard to get a handle on how people in Venezuela felt about Donald Trump's actions because they'd have been locked up if they were caught protesting in favour of them on the streets of Caracas. But outside Venezuela, an awful lot of Venezuelans greeted the news that their dictator, their unelected president, had been kidnapped by American forces with joy. It's almost as if my enemy's enemy is my friend, which is a cliche for a reason. It makes perfect sense, doesn't it, morally and intellectually? Of course my enemy's enemy is my friend, until they've dealt with my enemy. And then we have to find out what they think about me. So even within 24 hours, I think, of the Venezuelan operation, Venezuelans were contacting this programme to air misgivings or to worry. And they were right to worry, I think, because Donald Trump don't have no interest in them or democracy, as we know, as has become crystal clear. But if you were Iranian, would you care about whatever instruments it was that were going to prize the Ayatollah from power? Would it matter at all that it was an intervention led by an administration that also shoots protesters dead in the street and then lies about it, albeit currently on a much smaller scale? I honestly don't know. And I'm glad I don't know, because it would feel a little bit ridiculous to sit here as a bloke who lives in Brentford and grew up in Kidderminster and somehow had arrived at very strong and pungent opinions about what should happen in Tehran, what should happen to the brave resistance, the people of Iran finding increasing voice and vigour in the face of a hideous autocratic religious regime. I don't know.